This is Designing the Revolution. You're listening to Chapter 28, The Revolution, Part 2. I think that's right. Okay. Well, first of all, apologies to those that you're listening to this regularly. I think I haven't done a episode for about 3 weeks. So as it happens, I've been in court, dare I say it. So less said about that, the better. But I'm hoping myself and Jamie are going to get on with it, and we're going to churn out the rest of the episodes between now and Christmas, and then we'll be done, as you might say. Okay, so the second talk of this chapter is about the Endgame. So in the last episode, I was talking about the run-up to this revolutionary event, strictly defined as a change of the regime. And what I'm going to talk about for the next 20, 30 minutes is the actual last month and the last week. So this is the apex of the whole series, I suppose, in the sense that this is the moment, right, when you sit on the throne, as it were, you get the ring, or whatever the analogy is, you actually take control of the government. And of course, this was a traditional podcast about revolution. It would be all about this moment. But I've spent the last, umpteen months saying to you all, that's not the deal, right? It's all about the preparation work. It's all about creating the culture, the organisational solidity, the strategy. And of course, the moment of revolution itself is not the end of the show. It's winning the peace as much as winning the war. Okay, so I'm obviously going to be coming on to that in the next episodes. All right, so that said, obviously it's interesting, to put it mildly, how actually regimes change, and using the model that we've been developing, how does this all sort of work out? So the first thing to say is, obviously, there's variations on the theme, right? It's not like there's one standard last month or standard last week, but there are general patterns and there are general things you can say about how you can actually, push over to your win. So looking at the last month, we've been using this model of four elements, four parts of the army that's moving forward, and it's not particularly, the deal isn't particularly about these different elements in and of themselves, as I've been saying. The deal is about them all working together in some synergistic whole and directed by a small central group that is strategically savvy, strategically coherent, and of course in service to the cause, which is asking a lot. And I'll talk about that more in a minute. But let's just look at how this last month goes. So here's some things that could or should be happening. First of all, we're building up an assemblies movement, right? So let's say in a medium-sized Western democracy, you're looking at 2,000 or 3,000 assemblies happening. They're happening in all the towns, all the villages, around the different suburbs of the city. These assemblies are building this movement, building a culture of respectful sort of deliberation, building confidence, building a collective sense that we are the people and we should be making the decisions rather than the old governmental institutions. So that's going on. At the same time, we've got these cultural events happening, and the cultural figures, the cultural events, say festivals, one-day events, evening events, banquets, and such like, and these are obviously connected with happening at the same time as the assemblies. And then you have the cultural figures coming to the big speeches. We've discussed how these cultural figures have more credibility, particularly at a time of radical change, because they're not associated with the old regime. There's plenty of historical examples of this. They're putting on Twitter, social media. It's building momentum. More people are finding out about it because conventional cultural figures, a pop star or lipstick artist, whatever it is, they're saying, this is what I do. And then at the end of the set, they go, and this is happening, you should get involved in it. And here's the link. All that sort of thing is happening. Then you've got the candidates standing in elections. So this could be happening in the year up to the event, the actual revolutionary event. And this could be on local councils, people taking over local councils. We've talked about this. But obviously there could be a national election coming up and people standing. Some people might be standing as independents, representing particular communities. That's one model. But the main model we've been looking at is people are going to stand in support of the assemblies. So these people have come through the assemblies. They're not like, hey, I think I'm great, I'm going to stand. It's more like, hey, someone's nominated me. I'm a normal person, but I've got some charisma. I've got service orientation. I'm someone who's going to represent and be faithful to this sort of assembly's ideology of popular democracy. Okay, so, and then we've got the direct action side. So, a few months before the revolutionary event or the big election that leads to the revolutionary event, then you've got all these assemblies coming up with a pledge card, like 5 or 6 particular things that definitely have to be done. These are the big demands, concrete things about injustices that are happening. And this gives legitimacy and direction to a civil disobedience, civil resistance movement. So we're saying we're demanding this. We want an end to corruption. We want the payouts to climate refugees that are done properly, and we're going to go and blockade the motorways until this happens. This sort of thing. And you can see this synergization between this isn't a direct action movement or a civil resistance movement that's just made it up. They've got legitimacy from these assemblies. They've got support from the cultural figures, and they've got people standing up in local council chambers or in Parliament saying, yes, I support them. Now, all of these things in and of themselves, as I said, are not particularly interesting and likely to be isolated. And all of them can, of course, degenerate. And several people have said to me, as soon as you stand people in elections and they get into Parliament, they're going to degenerate, and become part of the establishment. And this is very real. I'm not doubting it for a minute. And at the same time, it's not deterministic, right? And you can design it so the probability of this happening is minimised because they are ordinary people, they've come through the Assembly's process, they've made an oath, and they're part of this general revolutionary culture that we're actually going to change the regime. So, dare I say it, before communist revolutions, for instance, there have been communist MPs. It doesn't mean that they're going to desert the communist revolution, just to use a historical example. I'm not saying whether communism is good or bad or all that stuff. I'm just saying that it's not impossible. And in the Russian Revolution, there's lots of Soviets, and there were people voted into those Soviets, and that was a pathway to power. So that standing in elections, although it's got that impression of being a bad move of degeneration, it's not necessarily if it's combined with these other 3 elements. Okay, so I'm not saying that's the last word in the matter. Spend several hours looking at every revolution, every variation on the theme. But hopefully what I've given you is here's a working scenario for you to go away and think about. And as this last month before the elections that leads to revolution, all various sort of things we're going to talk about in a minute, you can see this building crescendo and these things working together and supporting each other. And then the other element is this external pressure, this big climate 9/11 event, which manifests itself in an economic crisis, running out of money. So we need to understand that the rupture event is a fusion of the ecological and the financial and the social. It's not like, well, it could be this or it could be that. It's always going to be mixed up together. The point being is this is the trigger. that takes you into the end game of the last month, running out of money, holding election. You go and read about revolutions, you can sort of see the pattern. Okay, so as we move into last week, let's look at a few ways in which the last week happens. So, again, this isn't a comprehensive list. In some ways, it's a bit arbitrary, but it's just to give you a flavour of how this endpoint happens. And I suppose what's important is I've said this a few times, but I'll say it again, we've all been brought up in a culture, over the last 20 years, up to 2023, to think revolutions in Western democracies never happen. But just to remind ourselves, they have, and they will, and they happen throughout modern history and arguably, through all of human history. So it is going to happen, and this is what it's going to look like. What's going to happen? So here's one scenario. One scenario is what I would call the Porto Alegre scenario, which is the political party, the Assembly's party, gains a majority in Parliament, and it uses that authority to set up a permanent citizens' assembly, a House of Citizens, or whatever it's going to be called. So that's what you might call a constitutional route that happened in Porto Alegre. They set up regional assemblies. We've talked about it. Even though they weren't formally constitutional, they had the legitimacy of popular power, and they created participatory budgets for the city, and the council was forced to accept them. In other words, you've got this dual power, dual this alternative institutionalization. So that's a nice, simple, ideal type last week scenario. They win the election, there's a smooth transition of power to this Assembly's party, and it creates the new institution. So that's one scenario. The next scenario is what you might call the classical street movement revolution last week situation. So this is where, let's say, there's a big climate, social, financial crisis. There's already the assemblies there demanding, the end to government corruption of the rich and what have you. They've already got this agenda. It provokes a street movement. There's thousands of people on the street. This provokes a general strike, or at least trade unions going on strikes in solidarity. And you get this massive crescendo over, 7 days to 3 weeks. And this forces the government to resign. And you might say the big example of this is in 1968 in France. You have the students going out on the street, and then trade unions come in, and there's a big hoo-ha, and it goes on. The big problem, of course, in 1968, in so much as it's the beginning of the horizontalist era, as it were, is there's no central committee to negotiate with the government and transfer power and represent the new agenda, as you might say. So yes, this assembly movement and street movement and the general strike has to have this central committee, for want of a better word, which is going to be trusted to actually negotiate the transfer of power. Okay, so you can see this is an ideal type. It could be combined with the Porto Alegre model. They win the election, but they're not going to be able to do what they want without the street movement, for instance. All right, so the third scenario, which might sound a bit counterintuitive, but it does happen, which is the government just collapses under the weight of its own contradictions. So throughout history, there's been examples where the elites are so totally self-destructive, incompetent, overwhelmingly useless that they even begin to hate themselves and want to be taken over, dare I say it. And not always, of course, but this is the situation which could be quite possible because there's so much denial around the climate emergency that when the shit hits the fan and millions of people start dying in big climate, 9/11 type events, the collapse in the legitimacy of the neoliberal pretense is going to be so extreme that people are going to say, I don't know, we've totally messed up. So you can see this a bit in Britain before the Second World War, there was this massive appeasement sort of process, and then Hitler went and invaded Poland, and everyone went, we need a totally new government. They totally failed. They made totally the wrong call. So again, this this sort of collapse obviously isn't going to happen in a vacuum. There is going to be the street movement, it's going to be the assembly, it's going to be the assembly MPs and all the rest of it. But they're basically going to walk into power because the whole thing's just collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. All right. And then the final one is maybe a combination of the above three, but it's a series of confrontations. And the confrontations create a backfiring effect, which we've talked about extensively in terms of how civil disobedience works. So there could be a general election, there could be an assembly, street movement, it could be a general strike, and then the police come out and then the army come out and some people get shot, or there's a big, the government presses that button and engages in some violence, maybe some people die, and that creates this big backfiring effect of even more people come out to the streets, even more unions go on strike, even more cultural figures, go on their social media going, this is no good, this has to end, this government's corrupt as fuck, it's going to have to go. And so you get the mix of the other scenarios. Okay, so again, we could talk about this in more detail and use lots of historical examples, but what I'm hoping to do is give you a flavour of how this is going to work out. And obviously, no one really knows, right? It's not like do this or do that. You're going to have to make it up as you go along, But that's the direction of travel, and the big ask is a new regime. Just to be clear, right? This isn't some amorphous revolution where we broadly want things to change. The whole basis of this series on designing a revolution, it has got a concrete, specific constitutional aim. It's not just that, of course, it's a cultural and social and spiritual revolution and all the rest of it, but it's got this essential element to it, which is we don't want representational parliaments anymore. What we want is permanent citizens' assemblies. And there's going to be variations on the theme, of course, and we're going to talk about this later. But this is the moment of taking power. The government that has been voted in, as it were, by the representational MPs stands down. And the new institution comes in. Now, this, is going to be messy. There's going to have to be a ratification process. Maybe it's not even ratified. But if you're going to point to the day of the revolution, as it were, that's the day when the government stands down and the new central committee, as it were, of this big social uprising says, right, we're going to have a citizens' assembly. All right, so the sort of elephant in the room is who the hell is this central committee, right? So to sort of enter into this little debate or big debate, I want to make a separation between the organisation and the movement. Okay. So we've talked about this again in the lead up to this revolutionary period, which is people, the horizontalist inheritance, as it were, of Western radicalism is there's a movement, it's going to take power, and what we've been saying for weeks and weeks is no, there has to be an organisation, there has to be a formal power structure, there has to be a membership, there has to be those people are running the show, they have our trust, we have a mechanism to get rid of them, there's various constitutional arrangements. And that organisation is basically going to take control in that moment of revolution. And it's supported synergistically, as it were, with this big uprising where people have never heard of the organisation, they're just coming on the street in the last moment, or an organisation isn't part of the organisation, the trade union isn't, but they're coming in at the last moment because they're going to go, what the hell, we need a big change. So you've got the advantage of this rapid horizontalist uprising, because we've got loads of examples of that, and you've got the advantage of having the central committee, which is objectively necessary in order to actually create a new centre of power. And the centre of power is not a social construction. What I mean by that is it's not you can do away with it, right? It's a metaphysical reality. And this is the big learning for the 21st century, and why horizontalist is philosophically illiterate, as it were, is that the center of power means that decisions have to be made which affect everyone, and someone makes those decisions. And if you don't have someone making those decisions, someone's making those decisions anyway, right? By the nature of the decision not being made. Someone has to decide to take power. Otherwise, the people who have power continue to have power. It's not like there's some period where there isn't power, because power is rooted in the necessity to make decisions which affect everyone, or make decisions which aren't going to affect everyone, which affects everyone anyway, right? You see, hopefully you see what I mean. I've been talking about this for weeks. Now, that does not mean that there aren't massive problems with having a central committee. So the whole horizontalist critique, which came out of, the revulsion against Stalinism and all the rest of it in 1968, has a massive validity, but it's not the whole story. So the whole purpose of this series is to make this proposition that we can't do without the central committee, but it doesn't have to turn into Stalinism. It doesn't have to turn into some nasty yucks, 20th century violent patriarchal bollocks situation. In so much as it's not, we have to design in elements of that central committee which minimise the probability, right? So there's no guarantees here. There's nothing I'm saying here that's guaranteed, but we're saying the probabilities are better than just sitting around waiting to die, or having a horizontalist revolution which by definition is going to lose control, and reactionary forces are going to move into the vacuum and all the rest of it. Egypt 2012 and all that stuff. All right, so we've already established that the Central Committee is coming through the organisation, which is taking the vanguardist position in the revolutionary episode. So how do we stop that committee going, thank you very much, and going down this path of going, actually, we're going to stay in control, and actually we're going to use the state monopoly of violence to do in any competitors and all the things that happened in 1917, if you want to read the history of the classical sort of mess up that revolutions tend to end up in. All right, so I've got four or five ideas here, which are historically, drawn from history, in so much as it doesn't always happen. So, for instance, the first one is that the revolution is going to be non-violent. The reason why this is important, we've discussed this a lot of times, right, isn't just because it's ethical to be non-violent. It isn't just that as soon as you have violence in a culture, it basically destroys the collectivity, the sociability of the culture. It's also because if you have a violent culture, then the people that take control are going to be in that culture, and the temptation obviously is going to be, well, we'll just use violence because that's the tradition we've come from. That's a total disaster, but it doesn't necessarily have to happen if there's a culture of service and a deep democratic culture which comes out of this assembly creation. So the historical example here, which is the American Revolution, where there was a long tradition of town hall meetings, local democracy and what have you. And Washington, as the main general, he, won lots of the battles and all the rest of it. And he could have taken control, but he didn't because of the quality of his leadership, because he was already embedded in this culture of he was in service to this democratic revolution, which was genuinely democratic. And obviously, it was lucky because he was, I'm sure he had lots of downsides and blah, blah, blah. But on the particular subject of wanting to take power, he didn't. He said, right, I'm going back to my farm. Thank you very much. So you've got these different elements. Obviously, you need to have some cool person with a great character. So that's not an insignificant issue. You need to have this general culture of democracy. And the third element is it needs to be non-violent. Okay, so that's useful. The second thing is is the Central Committee has to ask permission. So a few months ago, 2 or 3 months ago now, we're in December 2023 making this. As some of you may know, there was a big, thousands of people sat down in the Netherlands to get the government to stop subsidies on fossil fuels. And I talked to the organisers of it. And to be honest, I can't remember whether it was my idea or their idea. But basically, it came up with the idea that their big innovation was the A22 innovation, which was you've got to have the central group that's making these executive decisions. But they had this really good move, which we both discussed, myself and this group, of saying, let's ask the movement for permission. And the great thing about this is you're creating a vulnerability. So it's the opposite of the violent culture where you're basically saying, we're in control, and if you don't like it, we're going to purge you, we're going to get rid of you, and ultimately we're going to kill you. It's a completely different approach, which is saying, here we are, we think we're the people for the job, we think that it needs a central committee, we're putting ourselves before you. If you don't want us, then say so. And obviously that needs to have some sort of institutional form, maybe people go and voted. And 8 times out of 10, people will go, okay, yeah, you're not only do you seem to be the right people for the job, but also we're impressed by you showing your vulnerability and saying, if you don't want us, fair enough, but, it's over to you guys. So this creates this trust bond between the Central Committee and the organisation and the movement, right? This is what needs to be designed, and that's a central part of it. So there's 2 or 3 other sort of elements here which are more like institutional rules. So the first one is rotation, right? These people aren't going to be there forever. When they say we're going to be part of the Central Committee, everyone knows that in a year they're going to be replaced, or at least they're open to be renominated in some constitutional way. And they know that when they're put into position, and the movement and the organisation knows that as well. So it's all transparent. So if they do decide to go, I think I'm great, I'm going to stay on for another year, it's like everyone knows they're being a dick. It's like the person can't pretend that they can't, it wasn't really clear, and all that sort of stuff. The Sortition Council. So, this is an idea dreamed up with a few other people. So it may be cool, it might not be. But you have the Central Committee, and then you have a Sortition Council above it. We've talked about this a bit. So it's a little bit like a board. It's selected from the organisation. So it's ordinary people that have got common sense. They've got service orientation, and they're saying they've got the power basically to make sure that Central Committee has operational control over the revolution. They're going to negotiate and all the rest of it. But there's a confinedness to their power. They can't break the constitution. They can't go off and become dictators. If they're abusive or turn violent, they can say, no, that's the end of you. And if there's some big division or conflict within the Central Committee, they can mediate on it and ultimately arbitrate on it. So there's some variations on the theme of how that constitutionally can be done. So then you get the advantage of accountability with the advantage of operational sort of autonomy, i.e., to move people around, in the final week and negotiate with the government and all the rest of it. And finally, of course, it's temporary, right? Central Committee is there basically to oversee that last month, that last week, to actually have an organised and peaceful transfer of power, or at least to the extent that's possible. And then they know within 6 months they've got to stand down. So I'm listening to Mike Duncan's, what's it called? History of Rome. You should listen to it, it's great fun. So, with the Romans, this is a bit of a cliche, but when the shit hit the fan, they would elect a dictator, and the dictator would, go and deal with the crisis and bash up the barbarians or the Carthaginians or whatever it was. And then once that was done, often the dictator stood down of his own accord, because you had this republican civic service orientation, which is one of the reasons the Roman Republic was so successful. It wasn't just a total power thing, although arguably it was later on. Or they were deposed anyway, and someone killed them, or some variation in the theme. The point is history is full. It's full of examples of people being power mad, But there's numerous examples of people taking a leadership role and then standing down peacefully. And I've given you a few details of it. So yes, this is very possibly going to fail. And failure is good, as we've established, in the sense that, this could happen in Italy, it could happen in New Zealand. It could be a total failure, in which case everyone goes, right, we're not going to do it like that. We're going to, iterate on it. We're not going to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but we're going to analyse it like we've done in A22, do a campaign, what went well, what didn't well, you have a debrief, all this sort of thing. You learn from it so that the next iteration, which happens in Canada or something, is going to learn from it. So we need to understand it's not like every country in the world or whatever is in 1 week going to do this. There's going to be a sequence. There's going to be moments where the whole process steps back, goes into reverse, and then it learns and it goes forward. And the reason it's going to be learning is because of this democratic participatory structure, and this open learning process. Okay, so the last thing to say is I'm going to after I've gone through the whole revolutionary process, I'm going to do a few appendixes sort of episodes to look at sort of broader issues. And one of them is this, to look more deeply at this culture of service, which sort of connects with a more metaphysical or spiritual revolution, which really deconstructs the whole logic of power that's been going on for 10,000 years. That's a big project, but I think it's a necessary project. And I think this moment of revolution has to be informed by a very profound change in how we see the purpose of a good life. So people don't give up their power simply because they're being ethical. They give up their power, or they enter into power in service, because they literally think it's a stupid thing to do to become a dictator for themselves, right? That power it's not actually that cool. There's other things to do, like see your kids and go and paint a picture. You see what I mean? So that's something that needs exploring. And, I'm humble enough to say that, there's going to be lots of people need input on that, and it needs to be drawn from many different traditions. The point I'm trying to make is, in the 21st century, we need to dismantle that logic that's been going on, since 5000 BC. And the reason why we're going to realise that it needs to be dismantled and be successful in it being dismantled is because it's brought us to the point of human extinction, i.e. the hubristic notion that we can destroy nature and destroy colonised peoples and all the rest of it. It's bollocks. What it's going to do is just going to make us all enormously fucked, isn't it? That's what I'm trying to say. It's just no good. It didn't work, Good idea maybe at the time, but it doesn't work. Let's reconstruct what it is to be human and all the rest of it. All right, so I'm going to leave it there. So there you go. There's the revolution for you. What I'm going to move on to in the next episode is the revolution after the revolution, because as everyone should know by now, it's not a single thing, and most revolutions disintegrate into a total mess because no one's thought about the day after. So we definitely need to be thinking about the day after, and I'll tell you about that next time. Thanks.